The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass, that particular hum that only hospitals perfected, the sound of sterility and waiting. Katie Rodriguez pushed through the double doors of Cedar Creek Medical's Veterans Wing at 6:02 a.m., her scrub still crisp despite the heat climbing already into the San Antonio morning. The badge clipped to her collar read RN. Nothing more. Nothing else. That was the point. Her right leg made no sound when she walked. The left one did, a subtle shift in weight, barely perceptible unless you were looking for it, unless you understood what scars meant. The limp wasn't from nursing. It was from Bagram. From an IED that had turned a Humvee into shrapnel and left her needing 3 surgeries to rebuild what remained. She'd never told anyone at Cedar Creek about that. They thought she had a bad knee from standing double shifts. Easier that way. Room 302 came first. Then 304, 306, the whole north corridor lined with men whose bodies still functioned but whose minds had checked out months or years ago. She moved between them like water, efficient, purposeful, present. Vital signs. For lines. Medication distribution. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had held lives together in worse places than this, in situations where hesitation meant body bags and flag folding. Under 8 seconds per 4 line. She'd timed herself. Muscle memory wasn't just about muscle. It was about the way your nervous system remembered what it needed to do when the rest of you was screaming. In the medication room, she pulled 2 milligrams of morphine for Mrs. Chen in 308, drawing it into a 3 cubic centimeters syringe with the kind of steady hand that came from having done it thousands of times before. The vial clicked back into its drawer. The lock engaged. Everything accounted for. Everything documented. She had learned early that documentation was survival, that the paper trail was sometimes the only thing standing between you and accusation. Room 347 was at the far end of the wing, the corner room with the window that looked out over the city and the hill country beyond it. She'd requested the assignment there 6 months ago, though the request had been submitted through proper channels, nothing that would raise flags or questions. Just a nurse who wanted to care for a specific patient. It happened all the time. The man in the bed didn't move when she entered. His name was Marcus Webb, 28 years old, Staff Sergeant, 5th Special Forces Group, 3 tours, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart pinned to a shadow box on the visitor's table. The paralysis started at his neck and didn't stop. Mortar round. Spinal column severed at C4. The neurologist said he would never move anything below his shoulders again. The neurologist had used words like unfortunate and quality of life and all the other clinical phrases that meant nothing to people who understood that living and existing were 2 different things. Katie checked his catheter. Checked his feeding tube. Checked the lines running into his arms with the same careful attention she'd learned in medical school and refined in a combat zone where making mistakes meant watching people die. She didn't speak to him. She'd learned not to do that in the first month. The vacant eyes, the way they stared past her toward nothing, the slight tremor in his jaw when she moved him, it meant he was aware, but awareness without agency was its own kind of torture. So she worked in silence, the way she did everything. Silence was safer. There was a tattoo on his left forearm. She'd seen it 1,000 times and had stopped looking at it directly about month 2, the way you stop looking at anything that cuts too deep. Black ink, careful script. A name. Her name. Katie. Just that one word, the way soldiers sometimes mark themselves with the names of people they'd saved or tried to save or failed to save. She didn't know which category she fell into for Marcus Webb. The paperwork didn't say. Her handler hadn't mentioned it. And she wasn't supposed to ask questions about why the Pentagon had placed her here 8 months ago, in this bed with this patient, tasked with something classified enough that she couldn't even write it down. The morning medications went in on schedule. Pantoprazole for the ulcer risk. Baclofen for the spasticity. Duloxetine for the neuropathic pain. She'd memorized his entire pharmaceutical regimen weeks ago, the way you memorized radio frequencies and extraction coordinates when your life depended on it. The full lines took 6 seconds today because his arm was more swollen than usual. She made a mental note to tell the attending about potential thrombophlebitis. Professional. Detached. Nothing in her voice to suggest she cared more than a competent nurse should care about any patient. She was cleaning his arm with an alcohol swab when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway like a storm rolling in, except storms announced themselves. This man simply materialized, the expensive cologne arriving before his shoes did, Creed Aventus, the kind that cost $200 and announced to every room that you understood your own worth better than anyone else did. Dr. James Mercer was 43, had gone to Johns Hopkins, had been published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and carried his pedigree like a weapon. His scrubs were designer scrubs, or at least they looked like they had opinions about themselves. His shoes were Italian leather. His watch was a Rolex Submariner that caught the light in ways that seemed purposeful. He looked at Katie the way a person looks at furniture in a house they're about to purchase, assessing whether it suits their vision. Vitals on web. His voice was pitched to Carrie, even though they were the only 3 people in the room. The third person not counting. Stable. Katie didn't look at him. She didn't look at anything except the foresight she was securing with medical tape. BP 118/76. Heart rate 62. Temperature 98.2. O2 sat 99% on room air. Any agitation? No, sir. He stepped further into the room, his shoes clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that felt deliberate. Katie had learned to read people the way soldiers read terrain, identifying high ground, counting exits, assessing threat vectors. Dr. Mercer wasn't a threat yet. He was a doctor doing rounds. But there was something in the way he moved through the space, something in the calibration of his attention, that suggested he was cataloging things. Building a baseline. She'd seen that before. She knew what it meant when someone started paying attention to you. He's been stable. Mercer pulled up the electronic chart on the wall-mounted monitor, his fingers scrolling through the nursing notes with the kind of speed that suggested he wasn't reading them so much as scanning for details. No incidents. No behavioral changes. Not in the past 48 hours, no, sir. He turned to look at her directly, and Katie made herself meet his eyes for the fraction of a second it took to appear normal. Longer than that and you were challenging. Shorter than that and you were hiding something. She'd calibrated this years ago. 1 beat. 2 beats. Back to the foresight. You're new, he said. Not a question. 6 months on the floor, sir. 8 months with Cedar Creek total. He was still looking at her. She could feel it the way you can feel someone watching you in a crowd, that primitive awareness that lives in the oldest part of your brain. You seem steady. Most new nurses can't handle this wing. The paralysis disturbs them. The futility. They are not futile, sir. They are still here. The words were out before she could stop them, which was the mistake. In a hospital, like in a combat zone, the best way to survive was to be invisible. To agree, to defer, to fade into the background like institutional beige. She'd just made herself visible. Dr. Mercer smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had just identified exactly where a weakness lived. Idealism. That's a luxury in medicine, Nurse Rodriguez. Reality is messier than idealism allows. He turned back to the monitor and continued his scroll, and Katie felt something shift in the room's pressure, the way air changes before a storm breaks. She'd been in situations like this before. Not in hospitals, but in compounds and safe houses and interrogation rooms where a single mistake in tone or word choice could trigger consequences. She knew how to recognize the moment when someone decided you were worth their attention. She knew what came after. But she finished changing webs for sight anyway, muscle memory keeping her hand steady as her mind ran through contingencies. She didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. She simply moved through the work with the surgical precision of someone who understood that survival depended on not showing fear, not showing doubt, not showing anything at all. Dr. Mercer left the room 5 minutes later. His shoes clicked away down the hallway. The cologne lingered like a threat. And Katie stood beside Marcus Webb's bed, looking at the paralyzed man who wore her name on his arm in careful script, wondering how many people had to die for you to understand that some enemies don't announce themselves. Sometimes they just appear in doorways. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they decide, in a single moment of observation, that they're going to dismantle you, and they do it slowly, methodically, the way a surgeon approaches a patient on a table. She finished her shift documentation at 2:43 p.m., every line itemized, every vital sign recorded, every medication accounted for with the precision that came from years of understanding that the paper you leave behind is sometimes the only truth the world will ever know about what happened in a room when two people were alone. She didn't know yet that she had just made an enemy. She would find that out soon enough. But as she pushed through the exit doors of Cedar Creek Medical and felt the San Antonio heat hit her face like a wall, something in her posture shifted, something in her awareness recalibrated itself toward a threat she could sense but not yet see. The quiet part of her, the part that had survived Bagram, whispered a warning she was trained not to ignore. She went home to her apartment, showered off the hospital smell, and sat in the dark of her living room with the television off and the city sounds filtering through a cracked window. On the shelf beside her television sat a folded flag. American colors. Perfectly creased. The flag from Marcus Webb's deployment team, the one they'd given her 3 years ago when everything fell apart in a valley where mortars fell like rain and people died and kept dying until the only sound left was rotor blades and screaming. She didn't take the flag down. She didn't touch it. She just sat in the dark and understood, with the kind of clarity that came from experience, that Dr. James Mercer had no idea who he'd just started measuring for a confrontation. The next morning, she would arrive at Cedar Creek Medical at 6:51 a.m. again, and the real nightmare would begin. Thursday morning arrived like every other morning at Cedar Creek Medical in San Antonio, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical hymn, the espresso machine in the break room gurgling its pre-dawn ritual, the hospital corridors smelling of antiseptic and someone's forgotten coffee from the night shift. Katie Rodriguez moved through those hallways at 6:47 a.m., her scrub still crisp, her trauma shears clipped to her pocket, her badge displaying the name she'd borrowed 3 years ago for a mission that had no end date. Room 347 was 2 floors down. Her patient waited there, paralyzed from the shoulders down, his eyes still vacant most mornings, still unable to recognize the woman whose name was tattooed in careful script on his forearm, a name that meant something once, in a different lifetime, in a place where mortars fell like rain. She had no idea what was waiting in the Grand Rounds conference room. Thursday morning Grand Rounds began at 7:15 a.m. sharp. Katie sat in the back row of the Cedar Creek conference room, her hands folded, her posture perfect, her expression neutral as the attending physicians filtered in with their coffee cups and their clipboards. 18 residents filled the tiered seating. 4 attending physicians positioned themselves near the podium. The air smelled like fresh paper and old carpet. Dr. James Mercer was already there, of course, his tailored suit pressed to surgical precision, his silver hair catching the overhead lights like polished steel, his presence moving through the room the way apex predators move through still water, displacing everything, making the air pressure change. He smiled. He shouldn't have. He clicked to the first slide. Katie's patient chart exploded across the projection screen in 12-point font, her documentation magnified large enough for the entire room to read. Her assessment. Her notes. Her clinical observations from the previous evening when she'd questioned his order to sedate the patient during a sudden episode of agitation instead of performing a proper neurological workup. This, Dr. Mercer announced, circling her documentation with a laser pointer in red light, is exactly what happens when we lower our standards. When we let sentiment override science. When we prioritize feeling over thinking. The laser pointer traced her handwriting like an accusation. Nurse Rodriguez here has taken what should be a comprehensive evaluation and reduced it to fortune cookie wisdom. Patient agitated. Cause unknown. Recommend further assessment. Further assessment. He said it like it was a joke. That's not nursing. That's guessing. Laughter rippled through the conference room. Not loud laughter. Not mean laughter. Worse, the polite laughter of people who understand they should laugh when the powerful person gives them permission. Katie's jaw tightened. She took one measured breath through her nose. Her hands remained folded. Her eyes remained steady on the screen, though she could feel the weight of residents' gazes sliding sideways to look at her, assessing her reaction, measuring her for how they would treat her next. "Let's call her what she actually is," Mercer continued, his voice dripping like honey over broken glass. "Shortcut Sally. That's what modern nursing looks like, ladies and gentlemen. All heart. No brain." He clicked to the next slide. Another patient chart. Another opportunity to demonstrate his superiority. Katie sat perfectly still. A single tear escaped her right eye. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She reached up, wiped it with her thumb, maintained eye contact with the projection screen. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. After grand rounds ended, the residents dispersed like schools of fish, scattering into corridors and conference rooms, carrying Mercer's words in their pockets like currency. Katie stood and walked out at the same pace she always did, neither faster nor slower, her breathing controlled, her shoulders level. She had survived worse than public humiliation. She had survived Bagram under mortar fire. She had survived a 7.62 round that punched through her left shoulder and came out the other side. She had survived watching a teammate's blood dry on her combat boots. She could survive this. But survival and invisibility were two different things. The next afternoon, Katie approached the vending machines near the hospital cafeteria where two residents she once considered friendly were standing mid-conversation, Dr. Chen and Dr. Patel, both competent, both kind, both the type of doctors who usually acknowledged her presence with nods and thank yous. She was 3 feet away when Dr. Chen saw her. His body language shifted. Shoulders tightened. He turned his back. Dr. Patel suddenly discovered something fascinating on her phone screen, eyes fixed down, posture locked. Katie stopped where she stood, waiting. Neither of them acknowledged her. Neither of them turned around. She inserted her dollar bill into the coffee machine and watched it tumble down the metal spiral with a hollow mechanical sound like something breaking inside her chest. She was holding the coffee cup when Dr. Patel finally glanced up, so Katie was still there, and muttered something urgent to Dr. Chen before they both walked away without explanation. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Katie stood alone with her coffee and watched their retreating backs. This was how it happened, she understood. Not with spectacle. With small social excisions. With the weight of collective doubt. With the quiet message that you were no longer part of the tribe. She had built her entire cover identity on being forgettable, on being the nurse everyone acknowledged but nobody really saw. Mercer had dismantled that in 90 seconds of public mockery. Now the whispers were spreading through Cedar Creek Medical like infection, and infection required intervention. She set down her coffee and went back to work. The confrontation came 3 days later near the cafeteria, a hallway that connected the orthopedic wing to the main nursing station. Dr. Mercer was waiting, or at least, she would recognize later, he had positioned himself there with intention, loud enough to ensure an audience. 40 people in the cafeteria could hear through the open doors. That was the point. That was always the point with men like him. Humiliation required witnesses. "Shortcut Sally," he called out, his voice carrying across the hospital floor like a command. "A moment of your time." Katie stopped. She turned. Her hand rested on her badge. She was carrying a patient chart in her other hand, the documentation of Mr. Costianos in room 312, whose vitals she'd just checked. Her posture remained perfect. Her face remained blank. "Your clinical judgment," Mercer continued, loud enough for the entire hallway to process, or lack thereof, "is becoming a problem. Tell me, did you even finish nursing school, or did they just hand you a diploma for showing up?" He smiled. "Or did you forge the credentials entirely? I've seen your documentation. I wouldn't trust you to run a blood pressure cuff." The hallway stopped moving. Everyone stopped. Eating, walking, talking, all of it paused like a recording hitting mute. 40 sets of eyes. 40 witnesses. Katie's hand tightened on her badge. The metal bit into her palm. One measured breath. She opened her mouth and spoke in a voice that was quiet and flat and steady. I finished what I started, Doctor. Every time. It wasn't much. It wasn't a spectacular comeback or a clever refutation. It was just the truth, small and compact and delivered like a professional statement. But something in her voice made him hesitate. Something in her eyes, maybe. Something in the way she had absorbed the humiliation without flinching, without defending, without breaking. For just a moment, James Mercer looked like a man who had thrown a punch at a wall and discovered it was harder than he expected. Then he turned away, dismissing her the way you dismiss something that doesn't matter. Later that week, Katie performed her duties with surgical precision. She documented a medication error she witnessed Mercer make, a dose of heparin miscalculation on a post-surgical patient, meant to be 5,000 units but written as 50,000. She caught it before the tech administered it. She reported it through proper channels, the way protocol required. The way anyone who cared about patient safety should. She filed it and waited and understood, on some level deeper than conscious thought, that she had just made her final move on the hospital chessboard. Dr. Mercer appeared at the nurse's station within an hour, his face flushed, his movement sharp. 2 security guards followed him like remoras following a shark. His hand rested on his phone. That was the threat. That was the escalation. Not the words he was about to speak, but the device in his grip, the connection it represented, the power network he could activate with a single call. I could have you escorted out right now, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, for harassment. For endangering my career with false documentation. One more word about my practice, and I make that call. One more incident report with my name on it, and you're done here. Do you understand me? The nurse's station fell silent. Katie met his eyes. She didn't look away. She didn't apologize. She didn't beg. A single tear escaped her right eye, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact, the same way she'd done in the conference room, the same way she'd done at the vending machines. The composure of someone who had already survived the worst. I've been escorted out of worse places, Doctor, she said quietly. At least here nobody's shooting. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Dr. Mercer turned and walked away, his security guards trailing, his hand still on his phone, his face the color of a storm. Katie stood alone at the nurse's station, her hand steady, her breathing controlled, and understood that she had just announced herself to the wrong person in exactly the wrong way. But that wasn't the worst part. The next words out of his mouth changed everything. It started on Wednesday morning, 3 minutes after Katie clocked in. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Is this Catherine Rodriguez? A woman's voice. Professional. Cold. Speaking. This is Margaret Chen from the State Licensing Board. We received several reports questioning the validity of your nursing credentials. We'll be conducting a full audit of your file and employment history. Expect an investigator at Cedar Creek Medical within 48 hours. The line went dead. Katie stood in the break room, her coffee growing cold in her hand, and understood exactly what had happened. Mercer hadn't just moved against her. He'd activated a network. She could see the architecture of it now, 3 weeks of careful positioning, of whispers planted in the right ears, of doubt seeded like a virus through the hospital's administrative bloodstream. He'd called in favors. He'd made promises. And he'd done it with the precision of someone who understood that institutions were far more lethal than fists. By Wednesday afternoon, Katie had counted 7 staff members who wouldn't meet her eyes. 2 residents she'd worked with for 4 months suddenly found reasons to transfer to different floors. The cafeteria worker who always asked how her shift was going now served her food without speaking. The network was working. Mercer had poisoned the well. What Katie didn't know was that the CEO himself had received a call at 7:15 a.m. Dr. Mercer's voice on the line, measured and regretful. "I have concerns about one of our nurses, Catherine Rodriguez. There have been whispers from multiple sources about credential falsification. I hesitated to bring this forward, but patient safety requires transparency. I've already contacted the licensing board. You should probably know before this becomes a larger issue." By 8:27 a.m., 3 board members had received similar calls. Each one carefully crafted. Each one positioning Mercer as the reluctant professional, forced to report a colleague out of ethical obligation. Each one structured to suggest that Katie's problem wasn't a single mistake, it was a pattern. A character flaw. An instability that had been hidden until now. By 10 a.m., someone from Mercer's residency program had called Katie's nursing school in Austin. A woman named Dr. Helena Voss, asking questions with a kind of tone that suggested she already knew the answers. "We're conducting a routine credential verification. Can you confirm Catherine Rodriguez's graduation date? And her final GPA? Actually, while I have you, were there any disciplinary actions? Any concerns during her clinical rotations? We just want to make sure everything adds up." The registrar had hesitated. Checked the file. Found nothing. But the hesitation had already planted the seed. Doubt. The most contagious infection in any institution. At 2 p.m. on Wednesday, Dr. Patricia Huang from the State Licensing Board walked through the main entrance of Cedar Creek Medical carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of authority that made administrators nervous. She was 54, gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, and she'd been investigating credential fraud for 23 years. She didn't look like she smiled much. She asked for Katie's file. Personnel records. Licensing documentation. Continuing education credits. Background check results. The hospital's compliance officer, a man named Douglas Bradford who'd worked at Cedar Creek for 8 years without ever raising his voice, suddenly found himself in a position where he was explaining to a state investigator why certain documents seemed inconsistent with the dates Katie had listed on her application. "There's a gap here," Patricia said, pointing at Katie's employment history. 3 years between 2018 and 2021. Her resume lists it as independent consulting work. That's vague. Douglas's face went pale. He had no idea what she was talking about. By 4 p.m., Patricia was still in the hospital. Still asking questions. Still making notes in a leather journal that nobody else was allowed to see. Katie passed her once in the hallway outside the administrative offices, a woman in a grey blazer with a badge clipped to her belt, moving through the corridors like an auditor of souls. The message was unmistakable. This was official. This was government. This was the kind of machinery that didn't stop once it started moving. Katie's hand stayed steady all through her shift. She drew blood from 6 patients. She changed 2 dressing orders. She documented vital signs with the same clinical precision she'd maintained for 4 years. But underneath her composure, something cold was moving through her chest like a predator testing the perimeter of its cage. Mercer had done something she hadn't anticipated. He hadn't just attacked her professionally. He'd weaponized the system itself. He'd taken the institutional machinery that was supposed to protect patients and pointed it at her like a loaded gun. And because her entire employment at Cedar Creek was a cover, because her entire identity here was built on documents that couldn't withstand serious scrutiny, because a state licensing board investigator asking the right questions for the right amount of time would eventually find inconsistencies that would unravel the entire operation, she was trapped. She couldn't defend herself without exposing herself. She couldn't fight back without blowing her cover. She couldn't explain the gaps in her employment history without revealing that those 3 years had been spent in Kandahar and Fallujah and 3 other places the government didn't acknowledge. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. At 4:45 p.m., Katie was summoned to the administrative conference room on the 4th floor. The message came through her nurse manager, a woman named Sandra who wouldn't quite look at her. "Dr. Mercer specifically requested your presence. There's a board meeting. It's about credential review. Patient care standards. Katie knew what this was. This was the endgame. This was Mercer closing the trap. The conference room smelled like leather and expensive coffee and the kind of air conditioning that only ran in spaces where serious money moved. 12 people sat around a mahogany table that probably cost more than Katie's annual salary. The CEO, 4 board members, 3 administrators, and Dr. Mercer at the head of the table with a laptop and a wireless presenter in his hand. He was smiling. "Ah, Catherine. Thank you for joining us." His voice was smooth as surgical steel. "We were just discussing some concerns that have come to light regarding credential verification and patient safety protocols. I've prepared a brief presentation that I think you'll find illuminating." Katie sat in an empty chair. Said nothing. Mercer clicked to his first slide. It was titled Credential Verification and Patient Safety. Below that, in smaller letters, a case study in hospital policy failure. He was building something. Not just a case against her. A narrative. He started with her hire date. Moved to her first incident report, a minor documentation error from her first month that she'd corrected herself. Then her second incident. Then her third. He'd catalogued every single time she'd questioned an order, every time she'd suggested an alternative approach, every time she'd written something down that conflicted with his version of events. "What we're seeing," Mercer said, clicking to another slide, "is a pattern of behavior consistent with credentialing fraud. The candidate presents with impeccable surface credentials, but upon deeper investigation, there are significant gaps. Inconsistencies. Areas that don't align with the documented professional history." He clicked again. A slide appeared with Catherine Rodriguez's employment timeline. 3 years missing. Highlighted in red. As many of you know, credential fraud is a federal offense. It places patients at risk and exposes the hospital to massive liability. I have already contacted the state licensing board, who have confirmed they are investigating. The CEO's jaw tightened. One of the board members was taking notes. Katie's breathing stayed even. Her hand stayed flat on the table. Mercer was performing now, playing to an audience, and she understood with perfect clarity that this was his moment of victory. He was going to destroy her through the architecture of institutions. Through policies and procedures and official letterhead. Furthermore, Mercer continued, "I have documentation of several instances where this nurse has provided patient care that, while not directly harmful, demonstrates judgment that falls below our standards. I'm recommending immediate suspension pending full investigation, and I'm recommending that the hospital preserve all of her records for potential criminal referral." 11 seconds of silence. That's how long the room stayed quiet. Then Mercer stopped mid-sentence. His hand went to his chest. The color drained from his face like someone pulling a plug. He was gray. Actually gray. The kind of gray that means something has broken inside the machinery. He gasped. His fingers clawed at his collar. He tried to stand, and instead he folded backward into his chair, then slid sideways onto the floor. "Call 911. The CEO was already moving. "Someone call 911. Katie was faster. She was on her knees before anyone else even processed what they were seeing. She checked his carotid pulse. Nothing. She looked at his face. No respiratory effort. His pupils already starting to dilate. Ventricular fibrillation, her brain said. Massive MI. The heart doesn't forgive arrogance. The nearest crash cart was 4 floors down in the emergency department. The nearest advanced life support unit was in surgery with a patient. Katie had approximately 3 minutes before Mercer's brain started dying. Maybe 4 if she was lucky. She looked up at the CEO, whose hand was shaking as he held his phone. "Put the phone down," Katie said. Her voice had changed. It was no longer the careful, deferential voice of the nurse who'd been systematically destroyed over the past 3 weeks. It was command. "I need your pocket knife. Right now." What? Your pocket knife. The one on your desk. Now. He grabbed it, handed it to her with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. Katie opened the blade, found the intercostal space between the fourth and fifth ribs, felt the landmarks under her fingers the way she'd felt them 100 times before, on practice mannequins and on soldiers who couldn't wait for a surgical team. "Oh God," someone whispered. Katie cut. The blade slid through skin and muscle and membrane with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory you never forget. Not even when you've been pretending to be someone else. Not even when the wound you're opening is in the chest of the man who was just trying to destroy you. Blood. The scent of it metallicized the room. Someone gagged. Katie's hands moved on their own. She cracked his ribs with the heel of her palm, heard the snap of bone like a branch underfoot, and reached inside his chest cavity. The heart was there, pale and useless, beating the wrong rhythm. She began compressions. Gentle but firm. Massaging his failing heart directly, because sometimes the only way to save someone is to reach inside and do the work yourself. "Stay back," she said to the others. "Don't touch him." 30 seconds of compressions. She was counting. Watching the monitors that someone had wheeled in from somewhere. Waiting for the crash team that was running up the stairs right now, boots pounding, equipment clattering. 45 seconds. Mercer's lips were turning blue. She kept working. 1 minute. Her shirt was soaked with his blood. The carpet was turning red. The CEO was standing in the corner with his hand over his mouth. 90 seconds. The crash team burst through the door. A cardiac surgeon. 2 nurses. Someone carrying a defibrillator. They took over without asking questions. They'd seen this before. Someone doing an open cardiac massage. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. They loaded Mercer onto a stretcher. They moved him toward the elevators with the kind of controlled urgency that meant he still had a chance. Katie stepped back. Looked down at her hands. Looked at the blood spreading across the conference room carpet. Looked at the 12 people staring at her like they were trying to reconcile 2 different images of the same person, the quiet nurse who'd been questioned for her credentials, and the woman who'd just cut open a man's chest with a pocket knife and kept him alive through sheer technical precision. The CEO swallowed. His voice came out very small. What did you just do?" Katie didn't answer. She was already moving toward the door, already wiping her hands on her scrubs, already understanding that everything she'd built here had just collapsed and reformed into something entirely different. The room went absolutely silent. And that silence was the sound of her cover, finally beginning to crack. The conference room at Cedar Creek Medical occupied the entire northeast corner of the administrative wing, all glass walls and mahogany, the kind of space where important people made decisions that affected lives they'd never meet. Katie had been summoned there Wednesday afternoon, pulled from the veterans ward by a unit clerk with a message that Dr. Mercer had specifically requested her presence at a board meeting. She'd checked her appearance in the bathroom mirror before climbing the stairs, scrubs clean, hair secured, face neutral. Whatever this was, it wasn't a conversation. It was a performance. The room held 12 people when she arrived. Board members, administrators, 2 physicians Katie recognized from other departments. Dr. Mercer sat at the head of the mahogany table, his posture perfect, his hands folded with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times. He glanced up as she entered, and his expression shifted, a smile that had nothing to do with warmth, everything to do with anticipation. The air pressure in the room changed. Katie felt it the way a sailor feels a storm moving in, pressure dropping before the wind hits. "Captain," Mercer began, then caught himself with theatrical precision. "Ms. Rodriguez. Thank you for joining us. We've been discussing some concerning patterns in your recent charting. Shortcuts. Methodological gaps. Dangerous assumptions that could have harmed patients." Katie moved to the empty chair he'd indicated. She didn't sit. Around the table, she watched the board members' eyes, some curious, some skeptical, 1 or 2 already convinced. Mercer had prepared them. He'd been working these people for weeks, each conversation a brick in the wall he was building around her. "These are serious allegations," the board chair said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. "We need to understand your response." Katie opened her mouth. Closed it. The smart move was to deny everything, to explain, to defend herself with words and professionalism and the kind of careful reasoning that had kept her alive in interrogation rooms in Kandahar. But something in the room had shifted. Mercer's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. His jaw clenched. He'd been doing so well with his performance, but his body was betraying him, the tremor of a man whose hatred had reached a critical mass, whose need to destroy her was beginning to consume the oxygen in his own cells. He took a long drink of water. Then his hand went to his chest. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. For 3 seconds, Mercer remained upright in his chair, his eyes widening with confusion, his mouth opening as if to speak. Then his color changed, not the red flush of embarrassment but the gray-white pallor of a man whose heart had stopped negotiating with his brain. His body went rigid. His chair scraped backward as his legs kicked out involuntarily, and he crashed to the floor with the particular violence of sudden cardiac arrest, his body convulsing, his breath coming in gasps that weren't breaths at all but the dying sounds of a man whose electrical system had catastrophically failed. Someone screamed. Someone else reached for their phone. The board chair stood, her chair flying backward. And Katie, who had spent 7 years training for exactly this moment, who had held the femoral artery of a dying Marine while a Black Hawk rotated overhead in the dust and noise of Bagram, Katie moved. She was on her knees beside him in one motion, her hands already moving to his chest, checking pulse, finding nothing. His face was the color of wet concrete, his eyes rolled back, and she had approximately 4 minutes before permanent brain damage became inevitable. She didn't think about the fact that this was Mercer, that he'd spent weeks systematically destroying her reputation. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved on their own. "Call code blue," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a surgical blade. "Trauma Bay 4. Move." The board chair fumbled with her phone. Katie's fingers found the xiphoid process at the base of his sternum, marked the spot, and positioned her hands for compressions. But there was no time for the standard protocol, no time for the crash cart to arrive from 4 floors below. His ribs felt like fractured branches beneath her palms, and she knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd performed emergency medicine in a war zone, that he was circling the drain. She looked up at the CEO, whose desk was 3 feet away. His face was the color of old paper. "Knife," Katie said. "Now." He didn't move. She repeated it with the intonation of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and he lurched toward his desk, yanking open a drawer, producing a pocket knife with a blade no longer than 2 inches. It wasn't a surgical scalpel. It wasn't anything close to ideal. It would have to be enough. Katie took the knife. She didn't hesitate. The movement that followed was purely technical, her hands muscle memory, her mind calculating angle and depth and the precise location of the left anterior intercostal space. The blade went in at the 4th rib. The sound was specific and terrible, the hiss of air escaping, the wet pop of tissue separating. She widened the incision with her fingers, pushed through the pleural cavity, and there the heart. Fibrillating. Chaotic. Dying. She cradled it in her palm like something fragile, and began to massage. Her other hand came up beneath his ribs, providing counter-pressure. The rhythm was everything in compression, release, compression, release. Not fast. Methodical. The way you'd hold a bird with a broken wing and still have time to save it. "Pressure bag," she said to no one, to everyone, to the universe. "Somebody get me a pressure bag and 0 negative." Board members stared. The CEO had backed against his windows, his hand over his mouth. But Dr. Chen, the attending cardiologist who'd entered during the chaos, moved. She'd worked with military medicine before, had seen combat surgeons operate in conditions that would have hospitalized civilian physicians. She didn't ask questions. The crash cart arrived 90 seconds later, followed by the code team, followed by the kind of controlled urgency that only happens when professionals understand that the person beside the dying man isn't panicked, she's calculating. Katie's hands continued their rhythm. The team moved around her, didn't try to take over. Mercer's wife would later describe this moment as watching angels work, but it wasn't angels. It was competence. It was training. It was a captain with 2 Purple Hearts performing the only job she'd ever truly mastered. 80 seconds of massage. 120 when they pushed epinephrine. 150 when they defibrillated. His chest jumped. His monitor flickered. And then, sinus rhythm. The most beautiful sound in medicine, the beep 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 of a heart remembering how to work. They rushed him to surgery. Katie stepped back, watching her hands. They were shaking. Not from fear. From restraint. The trembling wasn't terror, it was the effort of not screaming at the top of her lungs that she was alive, that her body still remembered how to do this, that the years of pretending to be someone less dangerous than she was had finally come to an end. A nurse handed her a trauma towel. Katie wiped Mercer's blood from her hands. The room had gone absolutely still. 18 faces stared at her as if she'd dematerialized and reformed as something else entirely. The board chair's phone hung loose in her hand. The CEO stood pale against his window, watching a woman in scrubs transform in real time from potential liability into the exact opposite of everything Mercer had told them she was. The shift change occurred at 3 p.m. Katie returned to the veterans ward as news of the emergency rippled through Cedar Creek Medical like a current. She showered, changed into clean scrubs, and was checking vitals in room 347 when her personal phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, "We need to talk." 11 p.m. "Your apartment." Her handler. She knew what that message meant before he arrived Thursday night at 11 o'clock sharp, before he said the word she'd been dreading, "You're burned." Mercer's investigation triggered flags in 3 federal databases. "We're pulling you out tonight. The mission's over." 18 months of deep cover. 18 months of pretending to be smaller than she was, quieter, less dangerous. 18 months watching a soldier with her name tattooed on his arm stare through her with eyes that didn't recognize the woman who'd carried him 3 miles under mortar fire. All of it wasted. "I need more time," Katie said, but she already knew his answer. "It's done, Captain," he said, using her rank for the first time in 2 years. "Pack your gear. You're reassigned to Fort Sam Houston by Monday." At 3 in the morning, Katie sat alone in an empty diner 6 blocks from Cedar Creek Medical, her coffee growing cold against her palms. Outside, San Antonio slept. Inside, she stared at her reflection in the plate glass window, a ghost of herself, neither the nurse nor the soldier, suspended in the space between identities. She'd saved a man's life. And in doing so, she'd destroyed the only mission that ever mattered. The phone call came at 2:53 a.m. Katie was sitting in her car in the Cedar Creek Medical parking lot, hands still shaking from the adrenaline of the thoracotomy, when her handler texted a location. Not words. Just coordinates and a timestamp. Protocol when everything had fractured. She drove 6 blocks south in silence, watching the hospital shrink in her rearview mirror, knowing she was driving away from the only assignment that had ever mattered. The diner was called Rosario's, and it was the kind of place that stayed open for insomniacs and people running from something. Fluorescent lights hummed like cicadas. The coffee smelled like it had been brewing since yesterday. Katie ordered a cup anyway, let it cool untouched in front of her, and waited. Her handler arrived exactly on time. He always did. Colonel James Graves, tall, unremarkable in the way that made him invisible in crowds, carrying a leather portfolio that probably contained her extraction paperwork. He sat across from her without ordering anything, without preamble. "The state investigation triggered a federal flag," Graves said quietly. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, all controlled power beneath the surface. "Your nursing credentials are flagged in 4 databases now. If Mercer's people dig deeper, they find the military overlay. If they find the overlay, they find the mission. If they find the mission, they burn Cole's intelligence and 6 ongoing operations in 3 theaters. Katie's hand stayed flat on the table. Her jaw didn't clench. She was trained for this, the moment when everything you built gets evacuated in 72 hours because one doctor decided to make you his enemy. How long? You need to be gone by Friday close of business. We'll pull you from the assignment, get you stateside by Saturday morning. New identity. New location. Debriefing at Langley, then a quiet post somewhere you don't have to look over your shoulder. Graves slid a single photograph across the table. It was Cole, Master Sergeant David Cole, 75th Ranger Regiment, her patient in room 347. His eyes were the same vacant stare they'd been for 8 months. He'll recover fine. Better than fine, actually. Turns out he's been trying to communicate intelligence this whole time. Just needed someone to listen like you do. Katie picked up the photograph. Cole's left forearm was visible, the edge of her call sign tattooed there, Rabbit, in careful script. A Marine didn't carry a name unless she'd carried him through something that mattered. Through Bagram. Through mortar fire. Through the kind of darkness that doesn't let you forget. The intelligence. Katie asked. Classified supply chain operation. 17 months of investigation, waiting for him to give us the final piece. He's been trying to tell us for 8 months, but his vocabulary was degraded. Your documentation, every gesture, every eye movement you logged, that's what breaks it open once his motor function comes back. You did that. Katie set the photograph down. What happens to him? He recovers. He becomes an advocate. He testifies if needed. He lives. Graves leaned forward slightly. His eyes were the color of old gunmetal. You saved his life twice, Rodriguez. Once in Bagram. Once tonight in that board meeting. That's enough. But it wasn't enough, and Katie knew it. Missions didn't end on the protagonist's schedule. They ended when the operation was complete or when you were exposed, whichever came first. She had 72 hours to collect everything she'd built in Cedar Creek Medical and disappear back into whatever the Pentagon had waiting for her next. Graves left the folder with her and walked out without another word. He would be in another city by sunrise. That was how people like them worked, ghosts handing briefcases to ghosts, then evaporating. Katie sat alone in that diner for another hour. The coffee grew cold and then congealed, a film forming on top like the surface of something dying. She stared at her reflection in the window, hollow-eyed, pale, still wearing her scrubs that were stained with Dr. Mercer's blood. Stained with the blood of the man who tried to destroy her and inadvertently secured her extraction from the only mission she'd ever volunteered for. She'd trained for 12 years to do one thing: infiltrate, document, extract intelligence. She'd served 3 tours in combat zones where the lines between nurse and soldier blurred into something that transcended both. She'd carried wounded men through fire. She'd held dying men's hands while IEDs thundered in the distance. And then she'd come here, to Cedar Creek Medical, to a hospital in San Antonio, to a paralyzed veteran who needed someone to believe he was still human. She'd done her job perfectly. And in doing her job perfectly, she'd destroyed it. The rational part of her brain understood the calculus. Cole's intelligence was worth more than her position. The 6 ongoing operations in 3 theaters were worth the sacrifice of 1 deep cover assignment. This was how special operations worked: you moved pieces across the board, and sometimes the piece you most wanted to keep had to be sacrificed for the mission outcome. She understood that intellectually. She understood it in the way that soldiers understand the cost of war. But her hand shook against the cold coffee cup anyway. By Friday morning, she was walking through the Cedar Creek Medical doors for the last time. The fluorescent lights above the entrance flickered in sequence like they were counting down to something. She moved through the corridors without looking at faces, without letting her gaze linger on the unit clerk desk or the medication station or the break room where she and Dr. Chen had talked about patient outcomes just 3 weeks ago. This place had never been real. It was a cover, a role, a temporary architecture of false identity. In 72 hours, none of it would matter. She unlocked her locker on the 3rd floor. Her civilian clothes hung neatly pressed. A photograph, just one, that was all she allowed herself, taped to the inside, her unit at Camp Lejeune, everyone in dress blues, her arm around the shoulder of Lieutenant Marcus Webb, the one she'd carried 3 miles through Bagram in 2015. Webb died 6 months later in an ambush her unit couldn't prevent. The folded flag from his funeral was in her apartment in North Carolina. Or it would be soon, once she disappeared and a new identity consumed the old one. She was clearing her locker when the alarm started. For separate alarm tones harmonizing into something that sounded like the world breaking. The overhead speaker crackled. Code Blue, Room 347. Code Blue, Room 347. All available medical personnel report to trauma. Katie's hands stopped moving. Room 347. The paralyzed veteran. Cole. The locker door swung closed on its own. She didn't remember closing it. She was already moving through the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the resident who shouted her name, toward the room that contained the one piece of her Cedar Creek mission that had mattered most. The crash cart was already in motion. Young residents thundered past her, their faces stamped with the focused panic of people who knew they were running out of time. She reached room 347 as the code team surged through the door. Cole's monitor screamed. Flat line on the cardiac trace. His body lay motionless, his eyes still open but unseeing. A paralyzed man couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't do anything but wait for the outcome that medicine dictated. His respiratory rate had crashed. His oxygen saturation was 61 and falling. His skin had the waxy pallor of someone whose body was shutting down one system at a time, moving toward the only destination that waited for all of them. The senior resident shouted orders. Hands moved. Drugs pushed. The defibrillator pads went on his bare chest, and his body convulsed with electricity. Nothing. The monitor showed only the flat, accusatory line of a heart that had given up the work of living. Katie stood in the doorway, watching. Extraction protocol said she should not engage. The mission was already compromised. The assignment was already terminated. She was already supposed to be gone. Standing in a room with a crashing patient was the exact wrong move, the move that exposed her, the move that complicated an already fractured extraction timeline. She stepped into the room anyway. The resident looked up, startled. We've got this, we're managing. Move. Katie's voice had changed. It wasn't the deferential voice of the nurse who questioned doctors' orders quietly. It was a command, flat and absolute, the voice of someone who had made life-or-death decisions in places where hesitation meant death for people who couldn't carry themselves out. The resident moved. She didn't ask why. Something in Katie's presence made it clear that questions were not acceptable in that moment. Katie reached Cole's side. His paralyzed body lay beneath the hospital sheets like a prisoner in his own skin, conscious of the end but unable to fight it. She took his right hand, the only hand that wasn't covered with 4 lines and monitor leads, and she pressed it gently. I'm here, she said quietly, in a voice pitched only for him. I've got you. Just like Bagram. Cole's eyes moved. Just slightly. Just enough to track toward her voice. She didn't leave the room, even though extraction protocol screamed at her to turn and walk away. She didn't follow the rational calculus that said the mission was already lost, that this patient was already dead, that her presence here could only compromise what little remained of her cover and her timeline. She stood at his bedside while the code team continued their ballet of resuscitation, while the monitors continued their accusatory wailing, while the fluorescent lights above her head buzzed with the sound of machines that had never learned how to let anyone go quietly. She stood there because some decisions transcended protocol. Some moments transcended mission parameters. Some choices were made not by the part of you that was trained, but by the part that was human, and that part had no extraction timeline. The monitor beeped once. The flat line developed a bump. A bump became a rhythm. Weak, erratic, but present. We've got sinus rhythm, someone said. We've got sinus rhythm. Cole's eyes stayed fixed on her face. For the first time since his injury, since his paralysis had stolen his ability to move, to gesture, to communicate anything but the vast silence of a consciousness trapped in a body that wouldn't obey, his eyes held recognition. He knew her. He'd always known her. Katie didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She stood there, holding his hand, while the extraction protocol she'd trained for 8 years to follow evaporated like morning mist, and the life she'd built as a cover identity suddenly became the only real thing she'd ever wanted to keep. Like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next installment of these extraordinary stories. Comment below, if you had to choose between the mission and the person you'd come to save, which would you choose? And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were truly capable of, we want to hear your story. Thank you for watching.